I'm, yeah, I want to get to that second slide. Um, Oops. Well, that yeah, coming. Anyway, in recent years, we have seen all of these pictures and read articles about Russia being in Africa, and what does it all mean? We've also seen photos recently of Africans raising, flags and yeah, and I to get this to. Oops, no, I don't think it's going to move forward. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've seen pictures like this of jubilant Africans waving Russian flags, and I'm going to talk about this. Everything really started in Africa, West Africa, in 2017. And this was when Yevgeny Prigozhin and his infamous Wagner group established a Russian beachhead in Africa, in the country of the Central African Republic. Still having problems with this. Let me try this. Do not seem to want to go forward. Anyway, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So here we go. So the Central African Republic, right there in the center, and we had Prigozhin show up there. And in recent years, we have had military coups in Mali in 2021, in Burkina Faso in 2022, and in Niger in 2023. Now, we have had French counterinsurgency troops there for decades. They have been fighting Islamic militants in the Sahel area. But after the coups there and in the Central African Republic, they were told to leave. And as we all know, the French are not terribly popular in Africa. And in their place, we had Prigozhin show up in 2017 in Central African Republic and be invited to these other countries. Now, what was he doing there? Well, first of all, he was establishing some very lucrative contracts for minerals like gold and diamonds and chromium and all sorts of good things. And in exchange, the deal was that Wagner would come in, Wagner would start fighting the Islamic militants, and he would also provide protection, security to these new authoritarian governments. Well, so the French get pushed out, and then all of a sudden the U.S. starts getting pushed out. When there was a coup against a very friendly president in Niger, the new regime asked the United States to leave, and the U.S. had to pull out its 1,000 troops, which were there. But more importantly, the U.S. had established a drone base, and it cost them $110 million. And the idea was that the drones were there to go against the Islamic militants. Well, the US was forced out of there as well. And so the battle for Al Qaeda, Islamic State, Boko Haram, which had been really the mission of that base, now is in question. Well, about the same time, we had a new military regime in Chad. The son of the former president, Deby, is now in charge, and he asked the U.S. to leave as well. So, the primary focus of my talk today is going to be about these recent events. But given the breadth of this topic, as you can imagine, I'm going to focus mostly on sub Saharan Africa. Occasionally, you will hear me make reference to the north, to Libya, to Egypt, but really, I'm focusing on this sub-Saharan portion. But to understand what's happening right now with the Russians in Africa, I need to go back. I need to talk about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And I promise to be brief. We will get back to the present soon. But let's start talking a little bit about that period. Now, most historians date the Soviet Union having influence in Africa back to 1958. And in September of that year, the West African country of Guinea decided that they wanted their independence from France. Well, the French had a mechanism for doing this, and de Gaulle called it the Franco-African Community of Independent Nations. Well, Guinea wanted nothing to do with that. And Paris was furious. I mean, they went in and they ripped everything out of the country and said, "You're on your own." And don't write, don't call, we'll call you. So what does Guinea do? Has a new president by the name of Ahmed Sekou Touré. He turns to the Soviet Union and he says, I will have a socialist government and economy. And so he is the first foothold for the Russians or the Soviets at that time in West Africa. And then after that, there are two other West African nations, Ghana and Mali, who also are drawn to the Soviet Union's non-capitalist model of economic development. Well, the United States gets worried about this. And let's see if I can get my next slide. That way. Okay. So Washington says, wow, what's going on here? And so State Department's Bureau of Africa Affairs, as you can see, says penetration of Africa would permit the bloc to encircle NATO to the south, to have access to new markets and raw materials, and establish potential bases in the area. Well, you just have to change one word in that. Obviously, we don't have the Warsaw Bloc anymore, but if you substitute Russia, that quote is pretty much what people are worried about today, about what Russia is doing. And so the Soviet Union comes in and they have massive aid programs, development, but they also use a lot of soft power. So in West Africa, they establish news bureaus, and Izvestia comes in, TASS comes in, and you have Radio Moscow, and Radio Moscow has programs in French, in English, in Hausa, in other languages. And the other thing that the Soviets do is in 1960, Nikita Khrushchev establishes the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow. And they offer thousands of fellowships to young Africans to go to Patrice Lumumba. Well, it turns out, though, in West Africa, that some of this backfires. And it backfires because the Soviets provide the Africans with really poor quality tractors and goods. And then there are the Soviet trade organizations, and they just rip off the poor Africans. And so this is not, very well received. And then you have the Soviets providing them with books on economics, on communism. And these books really have little to do with the problems of Africa. The Soviets just don't have a clue, so that doesn't work out. Well, let's see, get the next one. And then they flood Africa with all of these exciting books, like a French version about Lenin or Le Manifeste Communiste. And these are not very popular. And the Soviets show these documentaries and newsreels, and they try to show them feature films. Doesn't work very well either. So this is not going all that great. And the United States sits back and says, hey, we can do better than this in West Africa. And so back in 1953, you have the founding of the U.S. Information Agency right here. And I have to say that Pat and I are proud veterans of this organization. We entered a little bit later, Pat, than 1953, but anyway, we were there during a good time. And so this is their mission. It's to understand, inform, and influence foreign publics, the promotion of national interest, and broaden dialogue between Americans and U.S. institutions and their counterparts abroad. Well, the U.S. has programs not only in African capitals, but they have centers that they open outside in various regions. They're tremendously popular. We had exchange programs like Fulbright that sent young Africans to the United States. But also, we brought American professors to African countries. And on top of that, we had all sorts of fun things. We had jazz programs and things that Africans really liked. So, on top of that, in 1960, John F. Kennedy founds Peace Corps. And the next year, we have the U.S. Agency for International Development. And, excuse me, both of these play really crucial roles in Africa. And what you have is influence in economic areas and agriculture, but also films and music and all sorts of fascinating things. And it turns out that African countries that have said, well, we will use the socialist model, when they look at what the Russians are presenting, the Soviets, they say, you know, that's not socialism in Africa. We we want to do something different. So anyway, let us turn to Southern Africa because we have a slightly different story. Um, and here, the Russian Soviets arguably have had greater success. And they have had success through supporting so-called African national liberation struggles. And these begin as early as 1960, and they go all the way up to 1990. And in countries like, as you can see, Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, Russia provides military support for engagement. They use proxies like the Cubans for national liberation. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the country of Angola, which you can see up there. Portuguese colony fighting for its independence. And Soviet Union provides all sorts of military assistance, but they also bring in Cuban troops. And they support a leftist movement called the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA. And they are in the battle against Portuguese colonialism. Well, what does the United States do? 1961 to 1975, the apartheid government of South Africa also gets support from the Soviets, but the U.S. is on the other side of that. The U.S. is there through the CIA, and it is basically supporting the white government. And in Angola, we are supporting a pro-Western movement called the National Union for the Total Liberation of Angola with a fellow by the name of Jonas Savimbi. Well, in 1975, in Angola, the MPLA, those guys on the left, triumphs. And their first president is Agostinho Neto. But the opposition, UNITA, continues to battle his government. And they do so until 2002 when Savimbi is finally killed. So Angola becomes independent. But because of this continuing insurgency, they turn to the USSR. They want support from Cuba, from East Germany, to train their troops and provide them with assistance. Much is the same in the country of Mozambique, another Portuguese colony. And once again, the Soviet Union is providing assistance there and in Zimbabwe against the white nationalists, Mr. Smith, who was in control. In South Africa, they are major supporters of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. And there, of course, we have a white apartheid government, and the USSR is seen as a major supporter of the ANC. Well, in those years, the Soviet Union is really quite successful in portraying America and its Western allies as reactionary imperialists, propping up racist regimes, whether we're talking about Zimbabwe or we're talking about South Africa. And Moscow has ideological benefit from this, not only in Africa, but throughout the developing world during these years. Well, what happens? Ronald Reagan comes to the rescue. Ronald Reagan supports the apartheid government in Africa, in South Africa. And things get worse because for Reagan, South Africa is a bulwark against communism in Africa. And there is a famous interview in 1981 that Reagan has with Walter Cronkite, of all people. And Walter Cronkite asked Reagan about U.S. support for the apartheid regime. And Reagan says the following: the African problem is a Russian weapon aimed against us. Well, this doesn't go down too well in the third world, obviously. And sadly, we find ourselves on the wrong side of history when it comes to what was going on in Africa. Russia, to this day, is able to get positive responses because of that history. So anyway, I'm going to continue at this point, and I'm going to talk about the end of the Soviet Union in Africa and how they dramatically pull back. And this comes starting in the summer of 1991. The Soviet Union is on the brink of bankruptcy, and Mikhail Gorbachev is the president at that point. And he decides, given what bad shape Russia is in, or Soviet Union, to suspend military and economic assistance to the USSR's clients. And this includes supporting them in other ways. He begins to talk about working with the U.S. To find peaceful solutions to what is going on. And he turns to, of all people, Ronald Reagan. Well, we all remember when Ronald Reagan was standing by that wall saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." But this is a little bit different. All of a sudden, these guys are working together. And so we have the transition to the Russian Federation continuing with Boris Yeltsin. And Boris Yeltsin even goes further. I mean, virtually any Soviet influence in Africa during this period in the early 1990s collapses. There are reasons for this. In 1992, only 2% of uh, Russia's external trade was with Africa. So, as a cost saving measure, the Soviet Union closes down any number of embassies and military support organizations in Africa. And it also dramatically ends arms sales. Russia is carrying an enormous amount of debt from the Soviet period to various African countries, Ethiopia, Algeria, Angola, Egypt, and Libya. And so Yeltsin says to the African countries, hey guys, time to pay up. And again, this does not go down very well. And during this period, the Africa press routinely refers to the Soviet Union as, quote, the land that turned its back on the continent. So, anyway, we have this disengagement by the Soviet Union. And more, they start to support the United States on Africa in the United Security Council, anything on Africa. And so you have Yeltsin there from 1991 to 1999, and there comes opposition within the Soviet foreign policy establishment. There are people who think this pro-West stance is just great, but there are other people who say, no, 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 no. We don't want the U.S. as this kind of only power, and we really need to go back to some of our old policies. Well, these internationalists, as they are called, win the day. So by the mid 1990s, you have Foreign Minister Yevgeny Primakov, who most of us have heard of, and he decides that Russia should start rebuilding some of its traditional alliances in Africa. And this is particularly true in South Africa. It's true in Egypt and Nigeria. And when Nelson Mandela becomes president in 1994, he says, yeah, I want to go back to the way things were because the Soviets were enormously helpful in our being able to push out the apartheid regime. So in the late 1990s, still under Yeltsin, we begin to see a change in the way that the Soviet Union in its last days is looking at what's going on in Africa. And they start to look at establishing preferential trade relationships with African nations. And in exchange for that, they will give them relief from some of the Soviet era debt. And they also resume arms to Africa. And sadly, during the Eritrean Ethiopian War in the 1990s, they were selling arms to both sides. And we have the infamous Russian arms dealer, Victor Bout, who becomes the middleman. And he is supplying arms and equipment to Sierra Leone, Liberia, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. During this time, there is a strengthening of the relationship with authoritarian regimes. And Soviet Union begins to oppose the resolutions on any sort of sanctions against countries like this. Well, with the election of Vladimir Putin in May 2000, Russia's resurgence in Africa begins. So I will now turn away from talking about the past and talk about Vladimir Putin and his first 8 years in power. Well, by 2000, Russia's economy has begun to rebound. There are increasing oil prices, and the country's gross domestic product and foreign debt are declining. And Putin comes to power not only with more resources, but with an antagonistic view towards the United States. And the first thing he does is he starts using Soviet era soft power tools to reassert Russian influence in Africa. So in the early 2000s, we have a return to a large number of scholarships for Africans going to Russia. And he also establishes trade organizations. Russia Africa Business Council in 2002 and the Russia South Africa Business Council in 2006. But there's also a change in the way that Putin does things. He sets out in a more pragmatic and quote unquote productive, positive direction. So Russian troops engage in UN peacekeeping missions. They do so in Western Sahara, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Liberia. And they also forge close relationships with major Russian or African organizations. And this includes the African Union, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. Finally, Putin tops this all off in 2006 by going to Africa. He goes to Algeria, he goes to Egypt, he goes to South Africa, and he goes to Morocco. And while Gorbachev and early on Yeltsin had taken a conciliatory approach in supporting the United States and the United Nations Security Council, Putin takes an increasingly anti-Western position. So when there is a proposal to have sanctions on Zimbabwe and Sudan, Russia opposes this in the Security Council. And in the case of Mugabe in Zimbabwe and of Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, Russia strengthens its relationship with what essentially are pariah states in many ways. And so during the first years of his presidency, or actually during the very final days of his presidency, Putin goes to Bucharest. This is the famous 2008 Bucharest Council, which is sponsored by NATO. And Putin is in power, as we see, only until 2008. And I'll talk about that a little bit. And what does NATO do? NATO says, hey, we want to provide a pathway for Georgia and Ukraine to come into NATO. Well, this does not go down very well with Mr. Putin. And so Putin memorably says NATO cannot guarantee its security at the expense of other countries' security. He is furious about this. And in many ways, this foreshadows the invasion of Georgia shortly thereafter, and also Putin seizing the Crimea in 2014 and invading Ukraine in 2022. Well, based on what at the time were term limits in Russia, Putin says, well, I have to step down. I've been in power for 8 years. So let's do this switcheroony. I have this guy, Dmitry Medvedev. He is my prime minister. He will become the president, and I will become the prime minister. And then after 4 years, I'll come back, but I'll be pulling the strings. And despite this, there was initial optimism about Medvedev. He just seems a nicer, more reasonable person than Putin. But in August of 2008, and we think largely with Putin in the mix, Russia invades Georgia, and they keep large portions of Georgia until this day. Well, Barack Obama becomes president in 2008, and Hillary Clinton is the Secretary of State. And so the Obama administration says, hey, let's see if we can have a better relationship with Russia. So Hillary Clinton goes to Moscow with this big red switch. And the idea is she is going to give this to Lavrov, the foreign minister, and say, she thinks it says in Russian, reset. We're going to reset our relationship. But they've gotten the Russian wrong. And instead of reset in Russian, it actually says overload. And so Lavrov looks at this, has a good laugh. And this is the beginning of the failure of that. And I have to say, anyone who has ever studied Russian knows how really awful Russian verbs of motion are. So it's pretty easy to get that wrong. So anyway, this fails. During his presidency, Medvedev from 2008 to 2012, one of the first things he does in 2009 is go to Africa. And he goes to Egypt, Nigeria, Angola, and Namibia. And the whole thing is he's kind of more of a laid back guy. So he goes to the pyramids and he goes on a safari and he meets with Zuma and he just seems like a much nicer fellow. But he does some serious things. For example, you had Brazil, Russia, India, and China that were going to become part of the BRIC economic bloc. And Medvedev says, what about South Africa? You know, we need South Africa in this. And he's successful. And so it goes from being the BRIC to the BRICS. And the South Africans are tremendously happy about this. And in 2012, Medvedev establishes something called the Russian International Aid Agency. And they start giving some aid assistance to Africa. And this is the first time this has happened since the Soviet period. I think when you look back on those 4 years with Medvedev, you can make the argument that he was as successful on the soft power side in reestablishing a positive image of Russia as much as on the military side, of course, in Georgia, and on the economic side with assistance. Well, what happens after this? Let's give this. Our friend comes back, and he's back in 2012. We all know he's there. There are no more term limits. They got rid of that. And what we see, and this is the beginning of my conclusion, Putin looks at the world, he looks at the UN, and he says, you know, Africa has the largest voting bloc, and I am going to need the Africans to vote with me for some of the things I'm going to do. And so he gathers support within the UN for what becomes a new battleground. You could call it a new Cold War between Russia, in this case, and the United States and the West. So you have the Russian invasion and the annexation of Crimea. And what happens is that the Africans largely kind of go along with this. They either sort of abstain or they are not there for this. So we see the beginning of Putin gathering this support. He signs military assistant agreements with 40 countries in Africa. And in 2017, as I said at the start of my talk, his close associate at the time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, arrives in the Central African Republic. There's been a civil war there. There is something of a vacuum. And so the Wagner Group comes in shortly thereafter and begins to provide the country's president, authoritarian ruler, with assistance against still active rebels who are in the country. And as I said earlier, Prigozhin establishes highly lucrative gold, diamond, and other mineral extraction agreements. And according to a recent Financial Times story, Prigozhin avoids those economic sanctions that came along after the invasion of uh, Crimea, which also got Russia kicked out of the G8, became the G7. He is able to set up Africa Front companies. And these Africa Front companies are able to use major banks like JP Morgan, HSBC. And according to the article, he's able to transfer something along the order of $250 million from the profits of these companies that he's establishing in Africa to offshore accounts. Well, what Putin says is, hey, this is not part of the Russian government, guys. I mean, Prigozhin is out there and he's doing his thing, and Wagner is there, but they're not part of the Russian military. So he has plausible deniability, as we say in the diplomatic world. If these guys do bad things, it's not us. I mean, this guy was my chef. Don't blame me. So anyway, this begins a hybrid organization for Russia, that they are actually benefiting from this, but they have Prigozhin and Wagner out there. And so this allows Russia to establish a stranglehold and an economic source of money, not only in the KAR, but also in other authoritarian countries. This includes Mali, Burkina Faso, as I noted, with the military coups there early. Well, equally fortuitous for Vladimir Putin, in 2016, Donald Trump is elected. And this leads to a dramatic change in U.S. engagement in Africa. In 2014, Obama sponsored the first U.S. Africa Leaders Summit in Washington. I actually attended it as an ambassador. It was a wonderful outreach to African countries and all sorts of new programs. Well, during the 4 years that Donald Trump was president, there was no such gathering. And it became increasingly clear during the Trump administration that all he cared about were transactional benefits for himself and his friends in Africa. Otherwise, he had no interest in the continent. And as you may recall, during a leaked conversation, Trump said he wanted nothing to do with these shithole African countries. This really came across very well in Africa. I was glad I was not an ambassador there anymore. Well, okay. So what happens with the Russians? In 2019, Putin has the first Russia-Africa summit in Sochi. And this is a great success. He has 43 African heads of state who come. And this really begins the formal resurgence of Russia in Africa. On one hand, he is using Wagner to carry out interventions throughout the continent. On the other hand, he is working with Prigozhin to profit massively from exploitation of minerals. And at the same time, Wagner is telling all of these dictators, not to worry, we got your back. We'll protect you. Don't worry about coups. So it seems that everything is going Russia's way. But then things start to fall apart. And they fall apart because of what Wagner is doing in Africa. Incredibly brutal attacks, the horrific human rights violations, rape, summary executions, violence against Islamic communities. And the United Nations in 2021 documents all of this and talks about what these bloody mercenaries are doing to Africans. And then there is a questioning of Wagner's argument that they are so good at counterinsurgency. In 2019, they go into the country of Mozambique, and they are battling ISIS insurgents there. Well, the ISIS insurgents see them and they just blow them apart. And very shortly thereafter, Wagner has to kind of crawl out with its tail between its legs from Mozambique. Turns out they really don't know how to fight African insurgencies all that well. And then in 2018, as many of you recall, there were these massive street demonstrations in Khartoum, Sudan, against the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. And so Bashir turns to his buddy Prigozhin, with whom he has made all sorts of deals to ship out Sudanese gold to Prigozhin, and says, God, come in, save my regime. And so Prigozhin comes in and he brings Wagner and they try to do all sorts of things. But a year later, the military overthrows al-Bashir. So much for the protection of Wagner. But the event that is the most dramatic, as we all know, comes during the February 2022 invasion of, of the Ukraine. Yes, of Ukraine. And here you have a situation, gotta go one more, it's better, where African nations have to respond to the invasion of a sovereign country. And if you've ever been in Africa, spent time there, one of the cardinal rules of all African nations is our sovereignty. And this is a hard one for them to swallow. I mean, Crimea was a little bit easier because Khrushchev had given Ukraine Crimea in 1954, used to be part of the Soviet Union. So one could argue, okay, the Russians might have had some argument there. But when the UN General Assembly puts forward a resolution in March after the February invasion of Ukraine, 28 African countries condemn Russia, condemn the invasion. And this includes countries like Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya. And then 17 other countries abstain. Russia's good friend, South Africa and Algeria, and 8 countries abstain or just aren't there. And the only country that backs Russia and votes against the resolution is Eritrea. No big surprise. So some of this opposition to what Russia has done in Ukraine, I would say, is Africa-centric. Ghana and Mozambique condemn the invasion because it has a devastating impact on Russia, on African economy, particularly the interruption of shipments of grain and fertilizer and other goods from the Ukraine. And Africa sees itself in many ways as a collateral victim of the war. But there also, at the same time, is a business as usual approach by African countries when it comes to the sanctions that the US and the UN have put on Russia, of saying, well, we're really not going to abide by that. And one of the most famous episodes comes in 2023 when the US ambassador to Africa, South Africa, accuses Pretoria of supplying weapons to Russia using this ship, which there are a lot of pictures of, despite South Africa saying that it is neutral in this war. And there are other examples of African countries getting around the sanctions. So Putin in 2023 has the second Russia-Africa summit, and the timing is not good. This occurs in St. Petersburg, and the Africans at this point are very vocal about their concerns on what's going on. And only 17 heads of state, as opposed to 43 during that first summit, show up. And the ones that show up are pretty unhappy. First of all, because 10 days before the summit, Russia has refused to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And this allowed Ukraine to ship wheat, desperately needed in Africa. And so they confront Putin and they say, why didn't you renew this? You've got to renew this. We need the grain. And Putin says, don't worry. I am going to ship free grain and I'm going to send it to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Eritrea, and Central African Republic. Well, only Somalia is not a close ally of Russia. He's sending grain to all of his good friends. And here are the majority of African countries saying, we're not getting any assistance from you. We've been left on our own. We have food crises in our country. So anyway, summit takes place, but there's also a question about the future of the Wagner Group and Prigozhin in Africa. Prigozhin, as we all know, just before the summit, mutinied. He takes his troops and he starts marching towards Moscow, and he stops. But he then says that he had this rebellion against the Kremlin because, quote, they were murdering tens of thousands of Russian soldiers due to the disastrous war in Ukraine. And the coup fails, but at the same time, Prigozhin still has a lot of his troops who have been pulled out of Africa into Ukraine, which he's very unhappy about. And you have countries like Central African Republic, Sudan, Mali, and others really looking at what's going on with Wagner and saying, can we depend on these guys? And one of the most interesting examples is during the rebellion that Prigozhin is leading, the Central African Republic's president reaches out to a U.S. security company. And this U.S. security company is called Bancroft Global Development. And he decides maybe that Bancroft is a better deal. Well, Bancroft has an interesting history. It was founded in 1999 in Washington, D.C., and it started out doing mine clearing in Africa and elsewhere. But in Africa, its mission evolved. And so in Somalia, Bancroft began providing capacity building assistance to the army in its fight against al-Shabaab. And in recent years, it has continued to do this by helping the armed forces in Uganda and Burundi. Well, the U.S. for years had been talking to the Central African Republic and saying, hey, maybe there's an alternative. You're not all that happy with Wagner ripping you off all these minerals. So anyway, we now have Bancroft working in the car, and they're doing training, intelligence gathering, but the State Department says, "Oh no, we're not giving them any assistance. No, this is something else." But we all know that the U.S. in general, along with the UN, has been giving money to Bancroft for years. And so this has led to all sorts of speculation that we're doing this covertly. Tony Blinken, when he was in Africa in January, had also said, hey, should look elsewhere than Wagner for support. And so human rights groups begin criticizing Bancroft, that they are not very transparent. And interestingly enough, in 2021, the U.S. Department of State's Office of Inspector General, for whom I used to work not too long ago, began investigating other claims against Bancroft. And they said that Bancroft had $4.1 million of unauthorized expenses from the U.S., and that 3.78 of that was, quote unquote, incentive compensation for employees. And so this is in a formal report from the Office of Inspector General. I have read the report. It is not clear to me, even though the recommendation on investigating this is complete, whether or not the U.S. Department of State has ever done anything with Bancroft. So, Bancroft has not received a lot of media attention, but I think it deserves it because we all know about the State Department's disastrous funding of Blackwater in Iraq. And I'm not saying right off the top of my head that Bancroft is Blackwater, but there should be some concerns. Well, we know that it was just a year ago that Prigozhin dies in a mysterious accident, which obviously Putin is behind. Plane crashes, he dies. And so the Russian Ministry of Defense comes in and they incorporate the Wagner mercenaries into what is called the Africa Corps. And you may remember from the Nazi period, it was also an Africa Corps, but it had a K rather than a C. So it's very different. We all know this. But many of the mercenaries still wear the Wagner insignia. They still like this. But it turns out that they're not doing very well, and they're doing particularly poorly in one country. One of the countries that signed up early, the country of Mali. And last month, you had Tuareg separatists in Mali kill at least 54 Russian mercenaries. Once again, as in Mozambique, in an ambush. And then last week, there was an Islamist organization called JNIM, which is an Al Qaeda affiliate, and they overran 2 military bases in Bamako, the capital of Mali. They went in, they killed all sorts of soldiers, they ransacked the bases, and then they went out to the airport and they burned the president's plane. And this did not go down very well with the president. So, for the first time since 2016, you have rebels, insurgents in the capital of an African country, of Mali in this case. So, the response by many Africans was the old "Where's Waldo?" except it was "Where's Wagner?" And that question remains out there. Well, Putin has not given up in South Africa, in Africa. He is using soft power across the continent. And he, in the past year, has increased scholarships for Africans to go to Moscow. They increased from 2,300 to 4,700. And earlier this month, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had a press conference talking about Russia Today as a military intelligence front propaganda organization. And he mentioned something called Africa Stream. And Africa Stream, he charged, is also a propaganda defense ministry front. And they're all over Africa on various social media fronts. So I will end it here. I could go on for another hour, but I won't. Where do things stand? And let me show you what I have concluded. Some of it is not that easy to read, but I will go through it. My conclusions are that the war in Ukraine, we all know, is entering the third year. The image of Russia in Africa has been seriously damaged. I talked about the sovereignty issue. Investment in Africa remains minimal. It is 1/10 of what the Chinese are putting in, and they're causing a food crisis throughout the continent. The model of the private hybrid force, with the end of Wagner supposedly being brought into the Africa Corps, does not seem sustainable. The war is draining Russia's resources, and its ability to provide regime protection and counterinsurgency is questioned. The legacy of Wagner's atrocities in Africa may turn many Africans against them, against having these mercenaries. And as we've seen, some African nations may look to the U.S. or elsewhere for support for security and counterinsurgency. China very clearly will continue to have more influence in Africa than the Russians and than the United States, frankly. And so this is due to the Road and Belt Initiative and their big projects. The U.S. under Biden has tried to make up lost ground. In 2021, Biden administration had the second U.S. leaders, U.S. Africa leaders. I think I have Russia down there, but I meant Africa. But if we have a second Trump presidency, I think we will see the same thing. I think we will see, again, the U.S. pulling back. So those are my thoughts. I thank you all for your attention, and I think we have about 20 minutes for questions. So please, what what did I say that either amused or dumbfounded you? Charles. Well, this was a report actually that Scott sort of flagged to me.